So moving on now into the Neolithic, what I want to do is look at the burial traditions there and what happens with the cult of the dead during the Neolithic, which is to say that namely it tyrannizes over the realm of the living to such a degree that the primary religious characteristic, I think, of the Neolithic, at least down to the pottery Neolithic 6500 BC, is that of the cult of the revered dead. If there are any gods at this time, we don't know what they would have been, but it appears that the cult of the revered dead may have existed as the primary religious fetish or icon rather than any actual deities as such. And so we can subdivide the Neolithic into a series of phases just so we know where we're at. We have the Mesolithic from 12,000 BC to 10,000 BC. Then roughly from 10,000 BC to 8,000 BC, we have the pre-pottery Neolithic A. From 8,000 BC to 6,000 BC, we then have the pre-pottery Neolithic B. I've rounded the dates just to make them easier to recall. They're a little bit rougher than that in reality. And with the pottery Neolithic, which is technically 6,500 BC down to 5,300 BC, we have a different epoch. We move into the epoch of pottery proper, but also new things begin to happen technologically that aren't present in these preceding phases. Now, the transitional people from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic are the so-called Natufians. So we go back to Palestine. The last time we were in Palestine was for the original burials of our Adam and Eve of the tradition, Q9 and Mashi, the Cro-Magnon and the Neanderthal burial. Now we go back to Palestine with the people called the Natufians, whose dates spread roughly over a 2,000-year period from 12,000 down to about 10,000 BC. They're divided into the early Natufians and the late Natufians. And the early Natufians are concerned with culture. They're creating art. They've got lots of sculpture and figurines. No goddess figurines, though. Keep that in mind. But they've got lots of animal figurines, whereas the later Natufians stopped doing the carvings, the figurines. The later Natufians come in right around, let's say, 10,000 BC, right in there. They don't last very long before they shift into the so-called Kyamians, which are the people of one of the first village sites of Muribet. And then the goddess will begin to come into being at Muribet. With the Natufians, what we see here is a truly transitional people, and I want to begin by describing one of their burials as a contrast to the burial that we ended with last time of the shaman woman, the 40-year-old shaman woman at Dolní Věstonice. Here we have another shaman woman, a Natufian shaman woman, dating back to about 12,000 years ago. So this burial is from the period of the later Natufians, 10,000 BC. She was found buried with the pelvis of a leopard, 50 tortoise shells, a human foot, the wingtip of a golden eagle, the tail of a cow, 2 marten skulls, and the forearm of a wild boar. And she was found curled up into a fetal position with her leg bones spread apart and folded under her. Her body, moreover, was weighted down with 10 large stones, and she was about 45 years old, and she had an unnatural asymmetrical appearance due to a spinal disability that would have caused her to limp. And so once again, we note here, very obviously a shaman woman. She has the characteristic disease that most shamans have, some sort of deformity or a disease. And she looks basically like a Paleolithic shaman. So we can see here that the Natufians do have still Paleolithic traits and characteristics, even though they are the first people probably to begin using agricultural implements and to begin to invent agriculture. Note that about her burial, we have the Natufians weighing her down. The body is weighted down with 10 large stones, which is something that didn't happen before in the Paleolithic. That indicates a fear of the dead now, a fear that the dead, and this is new, that the dead might arise perhaps and break into someone's dreams or walk around in the night. And this is a common burial characteristic of the Natufians. They tended to weigh their dead down with stones, and they clearly were afraid of them. They did bury their dead under the houses, under the floors of their houses, but very often, once they did that, they would actually move out of the house into another one of their houses, which is what, of course, we moderns would do. We don't want to hang around the dead, and clearly the Natufians were afraid of their dead. So we have now the first real, since Dolní Věstonice anyway, the first freestanding settlements with actual houses. And the Natufians are a kind of a Flintstones type of people. Everything about them is stone. They had stone plates, stone bowls, cups, and dishes. Their houses were these sort of igloo-like structures made out of stone blocks with lime plaster floors, and they didn't have windows. just a single central opening, and the houses were round. And so almost as though they couldn't quite get rid of the concept of still living inside of a cave. Now, whereas Paleolithic technology is catastrophic, it's based on speed and impact of abrupt discontinuities and sudden tension-filled encounters between the human being and the animal, the world of agriculture is much more uniformitarian. It's based upon a slow, inevitable grinding down of all things. It grinds not only grains and grasses, which now have to be ground down with mortars and pestles, and we find these for the first time appearing now in the toolkits of the Natufians, mortars and pestles and sickles. So they were definitely dealing with grasses and grains, whereas the Paleolithic hunters were not. But also the teeth wear down. They're ground down as the result of eating crunchy food. The bones are ground down as the result of sitting for long periods of time, scraping out grains to make dough. There's also the grinding of limestone into lime plaster through burning, pounding, and crushing, the polishing of stone into bowls, plates, and cups. And agriculture, too, also grinds down the environment, for these farming villages really tend to consume all their resources nearby. They cut down all the trees and they grind down the environment. So the whole technology is a uniformitarian technology of grinding. That's the characteristic nature of the agrarian world. Now, as I've said, they made the first sickles, and these sickles were very often made from the rib bone of a gazelle, and sometimes they would carve on the tip of it a little image of a gazelle, just the same way the Paleolithic hunters of the Magdalenian epoch were carving animals on the ends of their spear throwers, their latels, like they would carve a horse on there, as though the strength and speed of the horse would lend its speed to the throwing of the spear. And so too here, we have the carving of a gazelle. What a gazelle does is it eats grass, and the sickle is designed as a sort of extended jawbone because there are these little flint blades that are set carefully into it, locked into place with resin, and it's as though it were a jawbone eating the grass. So the power of the grass-eating gazelle lends its power to this instrument which cuts down the grain. So they're still thinking, note, in animalistic terms. And they set up their first villages, such as at Abu Huraira on the upper Euphrates, which was located near the gazelle migration routes. So they're still keeping in close view of the animals, even while they're simultaneously inventing agriculture. Now, it appears to be the case that agriculture comes into being right about 11,000 BC because Gordon Hillman found at their sites domesticated rye and einkorn. So they've got it up and running. But right about this time at 11,000 BC, a drought set in. It's called the Younger Dryas Drought, and it was the result of because the melting of the glaciers cooled off the warming Gulf Stream in the Atlantic. It caused a temporary reversion back to Ice Age-like conditions, which produced desiccation in the Near East. There were fewer grasses, there were fewer animals to eat the grasses, and the herds began thinning out. And it may have been that the invention of agriculture was a response now to this new desiccation. They had to come up with alternative food sources. This may also explain why the later Natufians were not much interested in art. They were more interested in technology and in creating new things like new tools and in dedicating themselves to the invention of agriculture because they had to do that to survive. So as we've said, they're burying their dead under the floors of their houses. And they really are a truly transitional people. This is clearly, we see them having both Paleolithic as well as brand new Neolithic characteristics. But now what I want to do is move on into a new site that's been found recently. It's called Gobekli Tepe. And this is a site that was recently found in eastern Turkey. And it's located up on the top of a hill that overlooks the distant Taurus Mountains, where we find here the earliest origins of megalithic architecture. So we're moving into a new age here in which we have a centralized authority, some priest perhaps, who's beginning to displace the shaman, who can direct the efforts of a large group of people to produce communal structures, big monumental buildings. What we find on the top of this hill, or what the archaeologists who excavated this site, Klaus Schmidt, found, was an entire field of circles constructed out of stone blocks, each about 30 to 100 feet in diameter, these circles, with the walls 6 feet tall. And the walls are composed of these T-shaped pillars that are roughly about 8 feet tall each. And they're arranged at intervals along the stone walls. Perhaps they were open-air temenoi. And on each of these pillars, there was a magnificent art of relief carving of animals, especially dangerous animals that are carved on each one of these pillars. We find dangerous animals like bulls and felines, snarling lions. We find charging boars. We find vultures and scorpions and foxes, all carved onto the side of these megaliths. Now, the excavator Klaus Schmidt thinks that if he keeps digging down, he might find bodies buried at the foot of each of these monoliths, so that what we might have here is a kind of, on the one hand, it's a Paleolithic sunset effect, because this is clearly still a shamanic people whose primary religious imagery is centered around the animal powers. And it may be that these animals on the gravestones, if these are gravestones, are designed like the Sphinx is in ancient Egypt to scare away evil spirits and protect these graves of the revered dead here. So we may have a kind of ancestor cult. It wasn't a site where people lived, because there aren't any leave takings. There are no daily habitation things that we would expect to find at a site like this. So it was a site that was probably, like Dolní Věstonice was, a seasonal site that was seasonally occupied, where people came and they offered animals. Lots of animal bones have been found littered all over the site, and they were offering animal sacrifices to these great ancestral animal totem spirits. And the animal totem is transmitted through the blood, and it's linked with tribal genealogy and the transmission of the animal spirit through the blood. Now, it's an amazing site, but there is a sequel to this site known as Nevali Cori, which is located not too far north of Gobekli Tepe, and it dates from a later period, from 8000 BC. But it's clearly culturally affiliated to Gobekli Tepe, even though now it's different. It's a culture now of farmers, not of hunters anymore. At this site, there was a central structure that was shaped like a square with the diagonals aligned to the cardinal points. And the entrance to the structure was open to the southwest. And if you walk inside of it, the worshiper would have stood before two 8-foot-tall T-shaped limestone pillars, exactly like the ones that we found at Gobekli Tepe, except that here, there aren't any animals carved on these pillars. Instead, on the sides of them, there are arms carved in relief, so that the pillars are actually stylized anthropomorphic human figurines, probably ancestor beings. They may have been associated with the so-called solstice twins that turn up in later tradition. And the temple had a meter-wide bench running along the length of the room, with embedded pillars inserted into the walls at various intervals. And on the southeast wall, there was this large recessed niche that probably supported a cult statue, and there was found a strange limestone sculpture of a creature with the arms of a man and a rather sinister-looking bird's head. And so the thing about Nevali Cori, it's a creepy sight. The imagery here, there apparently was a raptor bird cult. We find lots of sculpture of half animal, half bird, half human, shaman-like beings. There apparently were still shamans, but now they appear in ferocious, frightening form, which means that the shaman now, in the cult of the farmer, the world of the farmer, has taken on a negative valency, just as the dead took on a negative valency amongst the farmers of the Natufians. And there is this cult apparently of raptors. We find a number of these sculptures where one of them had the body of a bird and the head of a man. Another was missing its head but had a man's body and seems to have had the remains of a bird's beak for a snout. We find an image of a woman whose skull is being seized by the talons of a bird of prey. She looks like she's in a state of terror. An amazing art of sculpture here. We also find the earliest origins of a Kundalini-type image where there's a carved serpent squiggling up the back of a man's skull. So Nevali Cori is a creepy place, and this bird cult, it almost suggests that perhaps one could be, one of these giant bird-like beings could descend, like perhaps the Anzu bird in the later Mesopotamian tradition, or the Garuda bird in Hindu mythology, could descend out of a clear blue sky, pick one up, and carry the human being off to its nest somewhere. Not a very appetizing religious cult here. It's kind of frightening. Now, what I want to do then is look at the south. This is what's going on in the north. But in the south, contemporary with, somewhat earlier than Nevali Cori, but more closer to being contemporary with Gobekli Tepe, is Jericho, the great classic site that was excavated by Kathleen Kenyon. This is 9600 BC for Jericho A. And they aren't, unlike these northern sites, they aren't practicing, they're not very good artists. There's no developed art of sculpture at Jericho. What they did do was They invented mud brick architecture. They have round houses, mud brick architecture, and they're burying the dead under the floors of their houses, as the Natufians were doing. But and they're also removing the skulls, as the Natufians were also doing. But they're also taking the top half of the skull off and decorating it with lime plaster and inserting cowrie shells into the eyes to reanimate the dead. And there's a whole industry of it going on here. So the reverence for the dead, for the ancestral dead at Jericho was extremely strong. There really was. The dead were very cozy with the Jericonians, and they were basically integrated into the decision-making processes of the living. There's no doubt about that. But the other interesting detail of Jericho, and there are actually two of them, one is that for the first time we find a wall built at a settlement. It's a mud brick wall that surrounds the settlement only on its western side. And for that reason, because it's asymmetrical, the rest of the wall isn't there, it's hypothesized that it was more likely, instead of defensive purposes, it was probably erected to keep out mudslides coming in from the west. But now there's this famous stone tower, and there's nothing else like it in history that appears here as part of this wall. This thing stood about 28 feet tall and was 30 feet wide at the base. It was built out of mud bricks, as were all the buildings, of course, at Jericho. And the tower was embedded in a 13-foot-high wall, and it was surrounded by a moat that was 9 feet deep by 27 feet wide. Nearby settlements don't have walls. There's a settlement at Netiv Hagdud, which does not have a wall, which is a little curious. And it was originally thought that this tower, Kathleen Kenyon suspected that it might have been erected for defensive purposes. But if that were the case, the odd thing about it is that for defensive purposes, a tower is normally located on the outside of the wall, not the inside. But this tower is on the inside of the wall, because if it's on the outside of the wall, the archers at the top can lean out better to shoot down at the invaders. But since this is on the inside of the settlement, and since there are also dead buried at the bottom of it, inside of it, it was probably erected for religious purposes. One of the great excavators of the Near East, Ofer Bar Yosef, thinks that there may have been a mud brick shrine on the top of it. And if so, what we really do have here is the first vertical structure in history. And it indicates the beginnings, the earliest beginnings of the kind of ladder to heaven, the motif of the ladder to heaven, because you had to climb up a staircase on the inside of this structure to get to the roof, that later becomes monumentalized as the giant ziggurats in Mesopotamia and the pyramids in Egypt. This is the earliest appearance of the ladder, the motif of the ladder to heaven, which already means then that there's a certain alienation from the cosmos that's going on here, because in the previous period of the Paleolithic, if you wanted to get to the heavens, you simply consulted the shaman, who transformed into a bird and flew off into the heavens, where he could get information and come back with very important information about what the situation was with the dead, or where the animal herds were to be found. But here it looks like you had to ascend a tower, and so it looks like the gods, or the revered dead, perhaps are withdrawing. The heavens are withdrawing from the earth, and now they have to be accessed by a mechanical means. So this is what happens when the priest comes in and displaces the shaman, who normally transforms into the bird. And we saw how at Nevali Cori, the shaman is transformed into a nightmare bird. So he's taken on a negative valency there at that site. So that's Jericho, and it indicates the origins of the splitting of the cosmos now into the three worlds of the upper world, the middle world of the earth, the mesocosm, and the underworld. Now there's another site that's contemporary with Jericho. In the north, back up to where we were before with the sites of Abu Huraira and Muraybet, we have a site called Jericho al-Ahmar. And Jericho al-Ahmar was established on a pair of mounds with a central wadi running between them, and the site seems to have been founded by settlers who had drifted north from Muraybet. Since in the earliest levels there are these round subterranean houses partitioned into smaller rooms that are nearly identical to houses found at Muraybet. Now, in later levels of Jericho al-Ahmar, this kind of partitioned house architecture undergoes transformation into a single-room community meeting house. And there were two large ones, one for each of the two mounds. These houses were about 8 meters wide, and they were sunk down into the earth about 2 meters. So that's over 6 feet down. So these are, in a certain sense, they're the world's first kivas. The Native American kivas of the Anasazi were also sunk down about 2 meters down. They were just tall enough in the ground for a man to stand upright. And the Hopi, who are the descendants of the Anasazi, say that the symbolism of the kiva is that it represents the origins of the underworld, from whence the first human beings originated. They came up out of the ground. They climbed up the first reed and came up to this world, the fourth world. And the ladder that leads down into the underworld is symbolic of that first reed. And so it looks like here too, in contrast to Jericho, where the ascent is moving upward towards spiritual powers, here it's going downward toward the realm of the ancestors, which appear to have come up out of the earth. And so we begin to see the opening up of an abyssal world beneath our feet at al-Ahmar. So we've got the cosmos beginning to bifurcate now and separate, and this is going to lead into what I'm going to call the Great Rift, which we will see will become a major problem for the Bronze Age civilizations. The Great Rift between the heavenly powers and the mortal powers of the humans down here below, who are merely mortal. The gods withdraw to the heavens or down into the underworld, and the problem becomes how to reach them. Their accessibility becomes the issue of this time. Now I want to move, since we're in the north here, I want to move further into eastern Turkey, where we find another early site that dates from 8000 BC and is contemporary with Nevali Cori. This is called Chayonu. And at Chayonu, there are a couple of technological firsts. It's the earliest site at which we see copper working. So we see copper metallurgy coming into being at Chayonu. It was located near a mountain called the Ergani Madden, which is a mountain where you can find copper and malachite ores. We also find the earliest evidence for clothing at Chayonu, since flax was a crop that was domesticated there, and flax is used to make clothes. But we also find something rather sinister at Chayonu, and I'm afraid that we begin to find here the earliest origins for human sacrifice. It is thoroughly up and running, and at Chayonu it's an industry. Excavators found at this site a rectangular structure, which they called aptly the Skull Building. This is a rectangular structure about 10 meters wide by 8 long, and it's shaped with a curved apse at one end. And it was originally a single room with 3 subterranean rooms in the back, each covered with large stone slabs. And these cellars contained numerous skulls, piles of skulls piled to the ceiling. There were about 300 of them, of every age, men, women, and children. A large flat stone slab found in the center of the room seems to have functioned as an offering table. On analysis, it revealed traces of both animal and human blood, while the flint knife found in the same building also had traces of human blood on it. There's another structure at the site known as the Terrazzo Building, where there was found a slab decorated with a human head in relief carved onto it with traces of human blood on it. And blood was also found on the rim of a circular stone basin located in a corner of the room there. There was also a central drainage channel where it looks like blood was draining down this channel. So apparently human sacrifice is not only up and running at Chayonu, but there's an Aztec-like or a Hindu-like industry of it going on. And perhaps there was a myth in which they thought that human blood watered the crops, as the Aztecs believed, that human blood makes everything grow. It makes the sun god move. It makes the plants come up out of the earth. And so if you believe that human blood is required to make the crops grow, you're in for a very chilling and sinister society indeed. So I want to step back now and look at these sites, sort of give an overview of them, and take a look at what's happened here. We've seen the raptor bird, the chilling raptor bird imagery at Nevali Cori. We've seen the solemn stone megaliths with snarling animals on them at Gobekli Tepe. We've seen at Çatalhöyük, which is a site I'm not going to talk about here because it's been talked about to death, but there are skulls buried all over laying out on the floor, rather, all over the place at Çatalhöyük. There are images on the walls at Çatalhöyük of vultures descending down, eating people's heads and carrying them away. We get scorpion imagery here at these sites carved onto stones. All the imagery is chilling, morbid, and associated with the underworld. There are skulls everywhere you look. At Muraybet, they were lining up skulls along the floors of the living spaces, as some villages in Africa still do to this day. Lining up skulls along the floor. They have a very cozy relationship with the dead, and the dead are hanging heavily over the society. This is the great ancestor worship society. Technological evolution does happen here, as we have seen. There are a number of technological innovations, but they come in very slowly at a very hesitant pace, spread out over thousands of years, which is why the Neolithic has been subdivided into each of these epochs. PPN A, in which the characteristics are the architecture of the houses is round. There's a skull called in PPN B. The houses are largely rectangular, and roundhouse architecture begins to fall away. The skull cult is still up and running and very well practiced. New kinds of implements such as metallurgy start to surface during that period. And this is the period in which human society literally is almost literally, cosmologically and ontologically speaking anyway, is down in the underworld. There is no separation here of the realm of the living from the dead. The human culture is in the underworld. It's literally taking place. The dead are amongst us at these sites. They're around us. They're cozy. They're living in our living rooms. And so the dead normally, their job is to conserve, especially the revered dead, to conserve the original cultural archetypes, the sort of primordial Platonic ideas that were fashioned in illo tempore at the beginning of time, and by means of which they form the prototypes for the fashioning of everything else. And they have to be carefully guarded because if anything happens to them, then the society can disintegrate. And so there is an intuition here, and I think it's correct, that technological innovation leads to cultural disintegration. It's one of the primary factors that erodes a society. So there is something to be said for conservatism and casting a wary eye, as the Neolithic people did, at new technological innovations. So that's the situation here that we're looking at with the cult of the revered dead achieving its apogee at this time. Later, ancient Egypt will turn it into the scale of an entire high civilization. But here, the underworld has not been separated from the realm of what Ian Hodder calls the domus, the living space. Now, long about the year 7000, this whole thing comes to an end. Some sort of catastrophe seems to have taken place in the Middle East because almost overnight, the Rift Valley becomes depopulated. Villages like Jericho, Beta, Ramad, and Manhattan are all abandoned. And it's about this time that we have evidence of the first nomads beginning to appear in the north, at the site of Hayaz to the east, at the desert side of El Kaum, and in the Black Desert and the Azraq Oasis in the south, where the presence of Jericho spear points implies that these nomads may in fact have been refugees from these dying villages. Now, there's one village known as Ein Ghazal, which had a very heavy skull worship cult and creepy ancestor figures that were carved into these giant puppets that were made out of lime plaster with creepy, wide, staring eyes that become a motif that the staring eye motif becomes a motif of the Mesopotamian divinities when they start coming in later. But now Ein Ghazal was located on higher ground than most of these other sites, and it survived this catastrophe, whatever it was. And in Ein Ghazal, around 7250 BC, it experienced a sudden expansion of its population, which doubled nearly overnight, as though to imply that it took in a whole bunch of refugees from some catastrophe, which who knows may have been a flood. Perhaps this is the origins of the Noachian flood. Maybe there was a cosmic bolide or a comet that crashed into the earth. We don't know exactly what happened here. But at this time, the site of Ein Ghazal expands, and it has a second site that opens up on the eastern bank of the Zarqa River that causes the site to expand from overnight from 5 hectares now to 12. And it's about this time that we start finding mass graves at Ein Ghazal. Apparently that indicates disease, the spread of plague now. And the old practice of skull removal now vanishes, and a slovenly attitude to mortuary practices now begins to become evident. So all these sites are becoming depopulated. They're falling apart, and we don't know precisely what it is that's happened here. But it's probably a good thing because after this catastrophe passes, long about 6500 BC, when culture begins to resurface and reorganize itself, it begins to appear without the skull cult. The practice of burying the dead under the floors of the houses begins to disappear, and the dead are beginning to be separated for the first time into separate cemeteries. And once that happens, we get the temporal equivalent of the cosmological myth of the separation of the world parents. You know, Father Sky is separated from Mother Earth in the Bronze Age. Here, the separation of the dead temporally from the realm of the living essentially constitutes a separation of the past from the realm of the present, which opens up into the Lebenswelt, a new realm of the present, which is not so beholden to the archetypes of the past, and in which new technological possibilities can then come into being. And so we get, as we'll see in the next chapter, our next creative singularity, which is the pottery Neolithic, where all kinds of new technologies now start appearing once the mortuary rupture, the second of them, begins to take place here. So we'll look at that in our next discussion.